Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of Pepco, I would like to thank you for joining today's Decarbonization Forum. We are very pleased to be participating in Climate Week, with today's forum, from my perspective, serving as another important platform to explore pathways to accelerate decarbonization. We must underscore that we cannot combat climate change alone. We need key partnerships with our customers and the communities that we are privileged to serve, being foremost. Climate change is real, and we want to be a fully engaged partner in this process. We recognize the important role that the utilities have in shaping the future of energy, which from my perspective is inextricably connected to this looming issue. Before the program begins, a little bit of housekeeping. I want to first acknowledge and thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be with us on today. I also want to provide a safety message. Unfortunately, if an event were to occur, many of you have been in this building, but many of you have not. So I wanted to provide a few emergency details. Emergency exits can be found at the rear of this room, through the sliding doors, to the right, as well as across the walkway beyond the elevators. We also have a rallying point if there is an emergency, and it's at the southwest corner of 9th and G Street Northwest, across from the Martin Luther King Jr. Library. We are really excited about today, and we hope that this forum re-engages you as well as re-emphasizes information on the pathways that we all must take to decarbonize. What is abundantly clear to me, and hopefully to others, is that we have to work collaboratively as well as in partnership, and it takes the actions of all. In recognition of Climate Week, we have taken a significant action. We thought it was important that we ultimately offset our carbon footprint today with this event. We have purchased carbon offsets for 180 individuals, totaling 17 metric tons. This footprint includes the built environment where we are today, factoring in your transportation here, as well as the processing and the delivery of food for our reception this evening. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed President and CEO of Pepco Holdings for remarks, Mr. Dave Velasquez. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Donna. Good afternoon to everybody. It is very exciting to see all of you here. It's very exciting to be here together on Climate Week. It's a very important discussion I think we're going to be able to take part in this afternoon. Special thanks to Secretary Moniz, for our local District of Columbia and Maryland government officials, Public Service Commission staff, and others joining us, and also to all of our panelists. Thank you for being here today. It has been a very interesting few weeks when we think about climate change. We think about how, whether it's the appearance of Greta Thunberg before Congress and at the UN, the climate strikes that we've seen initiated by youth around the world, even right here in the district, the disruptions we saw earlier week, the fact that the focus and attention to pending climate crisis is growing. You know, at Pepco Holdings and at Exelon, we have defined our purpose very simply and clearly to work hard every day to power a cleaner and brighter future for our customers and communities. And we do that in a number of ways, whether it's investing in innovative technology, whether it's empowering our customers to manage their energy use, whether it's supporting decarbonization policies and actions, or looking at ways to continue to provide both resilient and reliable service, both affordably and equitably. We recognize, as Don had said, that we have to do our part to combat climate change and prepare for a world that has more extreme weather and a lot less predictability than we're used to. Most importantly, and why we're here today, is because we know we cannot do that alone. As I look around, many of you are partners in this effort that we have, whether it's in the policy arena, whether it's technology or solution providers, as renewable energy developers, or community and business organizations. And while we may not always agree exactly on how we achieve our goals, I think that we have a lot more in common because we do have a common goal, and that's a fundamental commitment to address the climate challenge, to do it quickly, and doing it in a way that brings the greatest benefit to the most people and at the lowest cost. To achieve this, we know there are areas on which we all need to focus, and there's areas in which the electric grid is going to play a critical part. Whether it's community solar, energy storage, transportation electrification, energy efficiency, these are all pathways to decarbonizing our economy, and they create value for our customers. In fact, in the District of Columbia, where we are today, a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions are directly attributable to vehicles traveling on city streets. Similarly, in Maryland, transportation accounts for more than 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity consumption accounts for about 30%. And direct use of fossil fuels in homes, businesses, and industries is another 20%. Both jurisdictions have taken significant steps already to address climate change. That includes establishing mid- and long-range emission reduction targets, bold renewable energy portfolio standards, including a 100% goal here in the district, putting in place other programs and policies to advance transportation electrification, and bringing more community solar online. Both jurisdictions are also and have been keenly focused on modernizing the grid to enable this new energy future and create connections needed to drive this change, both quickly, efficiently, and equitably. And again, here at Pepco Holdings and at Exelon Utilities, we share this future vision. Our vision is of a more decarbonized, more connected, and more consumer-centric electric system. And to do that, we have to develop a model that moves through the various stages necessary to create that platform for the future. Whether it starts with investing in reliability and resiliency, creating more options for customer self-service, enabling greater amounts of decarbonization throughout the economy, to eventually having a smart future that can achieve not only our energy and climate goals, but also some broader societal goals, such as public health, public safety, security, and inclusion. We envision a future and are moving towards a future in which the grid serves as a platform for all of us to interact simultaneously, securely, and reliably. And again, this is not something we can do alone. We know we need our partners. We know we need more innovation. We need a broader array of energy and resiliency solutions than we even have today. Just yesterday at Climate Week in New York City, Exelon announced a new initiative, a $20 million climate change investment fund to cultivate startups that are working on new technologies to mitigate climate change in the major cities where we have operations, which includes Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Wilmington, Atlantic City, Chicago, and Philadelphia. It will be very exciting to see what this innovative fund is able to help drive. So let me stop. You didn't come here to hear me speak today, and introduce someone and welcome someone who's an incredible innovator, someone who has had an amazing vision, and a person who's done a tremendous amount to drive both change that we need and to articulate a path forward to that future. Former Secretary of the United States Department of Energy and CEO of Energy Futures Initiative, Ernest Moniz. I think, as everybody knows, Secretary Moniz served as Secretary of Energy under President Obama from 2013 to 2017. In that role, he advanced energy technology innovation, nuclear security, strategic stability, and cutting-edge capabilities for America. He also led an international initiative that placed energy science and technology at the center of global response to climate change. And finally, he oversaw the development of the Quadrennial Energy Review, which took a very holistic view of our energy systems in the United States. He now serves at MIT as a Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems, is the inaugural Distinguished Fellow of the Emerson Collective, as well as CEO of the nonprofit Energy Futures Initiative and the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And that's just a small list that I promised I would not go on about. So again, a true honor and privilege to have the Secretary with us today. Welcome. I'm under my 3 minutes. So let me welcome and join me in welcoming Secretary Moniz.
sort of. Well, thank you, Donna and David. Although I do need to elaborate on something that you said, David. You said 2017 for my tenure as secretary. We should clarify, we're talking about January 20th at noon in 2017. But who's counting, right? So it really is a pleasure to be here and to kind of extend my Climate Week experience. I've been in New York since Monday, in fact, until late last night, and quite interesting. We had a chance to discuss several things I'll allude to today that we've been doing with our Energy Futures initiative, including what's called carbon dioxide removal proposal that we rolled out in New York, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, including our Green Real Deal framework for moving forward. We addressed a meeting specifically of the business community, which certainly has some relevance to this group here. And in addition, something we won't discuss too much about, but the issues of social equity and the like are really critical, and we also had a meeting of a global commission to end energy poverty. So there's a lot of different themes that came together, and what I hope to do is to leave plenty of time for a discussion on those and other topics of at least marginal relevance to today's discussion. In New York, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, and first of all, the energy that young people are bringing to this climate crisis is just remarkable. Given my professional career as an educator, I have a little hard time with skipping school, but that's the way it goes. I kind of like it, actually. But what was not mentioned was, of course, the now iconic photograph of President Trump with Greta Thunberg back over his left shoulder. Neither of them looking very happy, I might say, in that picture. When I was secretary, I have to say, and quite honestly, that working with the district, the government regulators, with Pepco, and we understand the very strong connections to Maryland as well. But it was really the city, writ broadly, was really very early in addressing these issues of a clean environment, addressing climate change, et cetera. And in fact, I think one of the areas where I remember very distinctly working with the city directly was on the electric vehicle infrastructure, for example. That was so important. And I believe it's true today that there are more electric vehicle charging stations than there are gas stations, which kind of tells you where we are heading. I have no car in D.C., so I don't mind having no gas stations for sure. But it does, however, say that I live principally in Boston, but I have a lot of experience here directly in the city, having had a residence for 2 decades. And I just want to say, don't worry, David, I just want to say that, it's anecdotal, but it really is a much more reliable system today than it was 20 years ago. So I think that's another area in which I would offer my congratulations. So getting down into the subject area a bit more, I want to start by talking about this role of and focus of business. I will talk a little bit about kind of the broad climate issues, and then bring it down at the end to discussions about Washington D.C. and the program and the especially in Washington D.C. With the overarching importance of the electric grid in meeting not only the goals that were spoken about, but other goals, such as those, in my view, of the social equity equations. We all know that there are in Washington, those on the somewhat lower end of the income distribution, at least relative to needs in this area. So that's also very important. On the business thing, first of all, I think it's always worth recalling that the president made his announcement about withdrawal from the Paris Agreement back in 2017, and it was pretty, the thud could be heard around the world in the sense that within days, first we had governors and mayors coming forward in large numbers to say, we're still in, and obviously, given the prominent role of states and mayors in our whole approach to climate in the United States, that's very significant. But I think even more significant was the more than 2,000 business leaders that came forward with that same message of we're still in. And I think that is especially significant because, as we already discussed in a certain sense with the 2017, politicians come and go. Business leaders are there making real decisions about long-term capital allocations and the like. And I think that was a very loud statement that we're past the point of whether we are going to have a low-carbon transition. They are not going to be doing their forward planning on the basis of that not happening. That was the real message. But I also have to say that I think that the scale, scope, and pace of that transition is very much still up in the air. Not what we want to happen, but what will actually happen. And it's the old statement that in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. And that's really kind of the issue. And we want to make the theory and the practice as close together, at least, as we can going forward. Now, in terms of where we want to go, for sure, it's really remarkable to think how much that has evolved even since the Paris meeting. That's less than 4 years ago. And Paris was very important, both for the agreement and the NDCs, the goals various countries put forward, but also for the commitment to innovation, which I would not be embarrassed to be on the high school debating team that took the position that will prove to be more important than the Paris Agreement goals, getting that innovation commitment. But it's an argument. But in the meantime, reports like the IPCC report on 1.5 versus 2 degrees, reports like the U.S. government national assessment have just changed the game. And so, whereas in Paris, it was, let's say the mid-century goal was 80% reductions in emissions. The intermediate 2030 goal was kind of all over the map. I would say 30% reduction might be a kind of a typical number in the distribution. But now, as we've moved forward, we are increasingly moving, and you mentioned the district's goal, for example, increasingly moving to net zero by mid-century, maybe 40, some places 50% intermediate goal in the 2030 timeframe. I think that having that goal of net zero, at least by mid-century, for the developed industrialized economies is really important. I do want to emphasize, and I think that the district's goal did not have, I think, the critical word net zero as opposed to zero. There is an enormous difference between those statements. And bluntly, may come back to this. That's the trouble with riffing. I tend to get out of order. I would say flat out, and then we can argue about it if you want, There is no solution that is credible for getting to zero. There is for net zero. So, and that almost automatically means there has to be large-scale negative carbon contributions. Now, for the district, those solutions are not likely to be implemented in the district, but implemented where supply comes from, implemented in the sense of offsets and the like. But again, we'll come back to that. But I think we really should have in mind what a tremendous difference of framework we have come to just in these last few years. Now, we at our EFI, Energy Futures Initiative, we've also given a lot of thought, not only to our specific studies, but to the framework that we think is the way to move forward as fast as we can. That goes back to the theory and practice difference. Namely, what we've put forward we call the Green Real Deal. And that's available on our website, and I think there are actually some copies circulating around here as well. What we want to emphasize in saying that is, first of all, make it clear, the fundamental building blocks with regard to energy and climate of the Green New Deal are fundamentally two. You got to get to low carbon, and you've got to do it with social equity in the foreground of the discussion. We are completely on board and aligned with that. But that's got to be translated into a real program, and that's the Green Real Deal. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I think it's worth discussing what we consider to be kind of key elements of that structure. One is we got to be pragmatic, and part of being pragmatic is we got to build coalitions that can really move the ball forward. I would be very hard-pressed to think of any major change, certainly in this country, that was sustainable, that wasn't just maybe a temporary change, without having built the appropriate coalitions that can move things forward. So labor, business, environmental groups, we can go on and on and on, all have to be brought together. And that means some compromise. It may mean, bluntly, not going as fast as we would like to go. But again, we got to go as fast as we can go, and not impede the progress, which is what often happens without a coalition. Then, in doing that, we really need to provide as much optionality and flexibility for meeting goals tailored to regional needs as we possibly can. That is a big deal. Next, and now I'm talking nationally here with the district, as we'll come to, and it will focus down, but we have to remember that nationally, the electricity sector is responsible for about 27% of emissions. And we and others love to talk about decarbonizing electricity. And we should. For one thing, we're making great progress. We have a lot of options which are being exercised in this. We see, of course, opportunities for increasing the footprint of electrification in the economy as a whole. 73% is not electricity today, and it ain't going to be 0% in the future. We are going to need a combination with fuels of some type. We'll come back to that to be realistic. So we must think about economy-wide solutions and not just renewable portfolio standards for electricity, for example, or clean energy standards for electricity. We need it across the board, and other sectors are much, much harder to decarbonize. So that's where a lot of innovation is going to be required. Now, there's also the social justice dimension. And one way to talk about that, just to bring up one arena, it's an area in which Chris Crane, Exelon, just was a co-signer of an op-ed coming out of the Climate Leadership Coalition, I think it's called, something like that, which is advocating for an approach to carbon policy put forward by former Secretaries of State Baker and Schultz and others, Hank Paulson and a few others, that had 4 pillars. A price on carbon emissions. They recommend starting with $40 a ton. A dividend to be paid out uniformly. This is where the social equity part comes in, just to make it clear. So, and as they said in the op-ed, that the modeling suggests that if one has an equal dividend for everybody, the lower 70% of the income distribution will come out ahead. So that's progressive. But now let's think about our political system and what happens if Congress sees nearly $250 billion flowing through the system. It's called sticky fingers. And if that were, as an example, if that were translated into, let's say, deficit reduction, that is as regressive as you can get. So that's only to, and there are other possible ways in between, but just to point out that there is an enormous difference in how the policy is set in order, in whether it addresses or exacerbates social inequality issues. We cannot forget, and for DC this is important, as I said earlier, cannot forget high energy prices in the absence of the appropriate policies are very regressive for the obvious reasons. So that's the second part of it, and again, and the Exelon and their colleagues in the council, or whatever it's called, are endorsing that dividend approach, which has that progressive characteristics. There are 2 other parts of the plan. One part of it is a border tariff on carbon, so that if you're importing from a country that has, let's say, no carbon policy, there would be a tariff to make up for the difference in the carbon policies in the United States. This is really important. It's got to be done. I would go out on a limb and say, and nobody's got a clue how to actually do it in a really kind of quantitative fashion, but very important. But the other pillar is that there would be relief from other regulations and incentives in lieu of the carbon price. And the economists will tell you that, of course, carbon pricing is the most economically efficient way to get to a very low carbon economy. I have a caution, and this is, and again, many of you influencing in the policy regime, I think, have to recognize. The economist argument is true if you have the ability and courage to let the price go to where it has to go to accomplish the goal. But if you bring in some vision of political reality, and $40 a ton, I would say, is kind of at the edge of that political reality. $40 a ton, I think, as many in this room know, sure is a technology game changer in the electricity sector in terms of different sources of electricity. I doubt it would have much of a technology shifting effect in those hard to decarbonize sectors. You would have to have the ability, frankly, to have those prices float much, much higher. A big political challenge. But I think we've really got to think about this going forward, because what it means is that little nice statement about, since you have a carbon price, you can remove a whole bunch of other incentives and regulations, has got to be thought about very carefully, because the baby can easily go out with the bathwater in terms of how other sectors are addressed. So that's kind of a general, kind of a big picture view of that. We did another piece of work a few months ago, and one of our distinguished advisory committee members is sitting there in the audience, on California's pathways to meeting its carbon goals. Now California has a very different mix from the district, and we'll come back to that in terms of emissions. But what I want to emphasize is the structure that we took in this is that we have to keep pushing on innovation of kind of the technologies we see in front of us today, keep driving down costs across the board in the next kind of decadal timescale to allow us to meet those intermediate goals, 40% or 50%, whatever we want to say. But for mid-century, I would posit that it is equally obvious that we don't have a clue what the real picture will look like for that net zero world, because we don't have the tools today. We need some real technology breakthroughs, like the very large negative carbon contributions that I referred to earlier. So that's the report we issued on Tuesday on carbon dioxide removal, which is saying we need $1 billion a year program of RD&D on those technologies. And that does not mean just the passion of the day, direct air capture. It means biological approaches, geological approaches, accelerated weathering of accelerated mineralization, new cultivars in the biology world, all kinds of different technologies. I'm not going to go through them, but we actually had 27 very different portfolio elements. This is the kind of game changer that we have to do. Another one would be if we ever get to the place where we actually have real low-carbon liquid fuels that have come from advanced biotechnology or something like that. That's been promised for a couple of decades, and like everything else, we can do it, but you wouldn't like the price point at which it's available today. So all we're saying is that there are multiple pathways going to hydrogen, using hydrogen as a seasonal storage mechanism. Many more pathways than I usually talked about. What we need to do is really have a commitment to that innovation agenda, and that will define different net zero scenarios, and the differences in those scenarios will mean a hell of a lot to how business plans actually evolve to address those questions. And that is where ultimately I think the policy evolution will occur to help guide those steps forward. Now, to say a little bit more about about DC specifically, now in this city, state, or not quite state, or whatever whatever government term you want to use to describe the governance structure, and again, closely linked in particular to Maryland with the energy supply. I think part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, et cetera. Here, by the way, David, I don't know. The last data I found was in 2017. So what I found for the district was just over half of emissions coming from electricity. Depends how you count with buildings and everything else, and over a fifth from transportation fuels, and about a sixth from natural gas. That's at least what I saw in the 2017 data. You probably, I hope you know better than I do what they are, but I'm sticking to my numbers since I read them on the train last night on the internet. And what's interesting is how, first of all, those three sources, the electricity, transportation fuel, and natural gas, account for over 90% of the emissions total. There's a little bit of other stuff, waste and wastewater and the like, but those are the three big numbers. And what's interesting is each one of them has one really long pole in the tent. And for transportation fuels, I think not surprisingly, it's gasoline versus, say, diesel fuel for what this city looks like in terms of its operations. For natural gas, it is residential. Neither of those are surprising. I was a little bit surprised in the electricity emissions, or at least the numbers I saw had over 60% in the non-residential commercial sector. And what's interesting, in my view, is having one long pole in each of those sectors really tells you where to go. Why did Willie Sutton rob banks? Because that's where the money was. So if you want to get rid of this carbon, you really got a great place to start with those three elements. And in the electricity sector, and again, you all can know better than I, but I think having the commercial sector such a big player really is a great opportunity to go after. So clearly, electricity is going to be important nationally and globally. Certainly in this city, with the obvious opportunity of electrification as well in the light-duty vehicle and home energy supply. You'll be very happy I'm getting an induction stove, soon. The role of the grid obviously is going to be critically important. I think as well, and I think I'm just taking coals to Newcastle here, but as that grid is developed further with reliability and resilience, smart is really important. And that's where I think we still have a long way to go for the full integration of IT with the grid. But on the other hand, this is where utilities will play or can play an enormously important role in having those kinds of those two critical networks developed and integrated to the extent possible. We understand that will require some regulatory issues to be addressed, but it's in addressing those and resolving those that one can have an enormous impact in not only providing the reliable transactional grid that one wants, but also in genuinely new services to customers. And so I think that that issue is going to be very, very important. A few years ago, 2017, I guess it was, I said only half-jokingly that the biggest energy story of the last few months at that time was Amazon buys Whole Foods. And it wasn't because of the energy use of Whole Foods. It was because of the implications of how is that world going to be organized around the big data companies, the utilities. Are big data companies going to have public responsibility for access and service? How that all works, I think there's more ambiguity than is generally recognized. Resolving that is critical, and I would posit that because of the long history of utilities having responsibility for public access, universal access, right now, I'd like to see utilities really play a big role in how this is all organized. And that goes right back to our social justice agenda. So I think that's really an important part of what we see in front of us. Finally, I'm just going to wrap up and have a little discussion with another chaotic adventure that I'm engaged in right now, which has been semi-talked about, not fully talked about yet in public. But we've been talking a lot. I've been talking a lot. Yeah, I've been talking a lot. You haven't been talking a lot yet. I've been talking a lot about, innovation solutions, technology solutions, regulatory solutions, and how this all makes going to net zero possible, frankly, by mid-century. But there's one element we haven't mentioned: political accountability. And that is going to be a critical issue, obviously, in 2020. We don't have a lot of time. I'm not making a partisan statement here. I'm just saying that we need to develop, and it's not, and I don't mean I don't mean at the presidential level. I mean at all levels of particularly elected officials. We need to have the kind of development that we saw on the original Earth Day, where basically the public said, enough's enough. There's going to be political accountability, taking care of the environment. We had 3 or 4 years of the most intense activity we have ever seen in terms of advancing environmental issues. We need something like that to come forward. I think the ground is being laid for that. Obviously, the Democratic candidates with that focus, but also the Republican side. We all know, I think many of us know, like the Frank Luntz poll that said the young Republicans are telling their elders, hey, you better get on this wagon or we're getting off. That's caught a lot of attention. So I think the groundwork is there. Something that John Kerry and John, I want to give John the leadership credit on this, and others, bipartisan. We are launching something that we're calling, some of you will grind your teeth at this, but hopefully the young people will respond in a different way. We're calling it World War Zero. Zero refers to zero carbon. It's edgy, a little edgy. World, obviously it's a global problem. And war, obviously we don't want war, but what we mean is we need a broad mobilization of the public to come together to try to create this political accountability. That's another piece which is well beyond the technology innovation agenda, but a necessary piece, I believe, if we're going to move as fast as we can go forward. So I hope, anyway, that picture, that's my general picture, and I'd love to have as much support in all of these dimensions as we can. Thank you.
My name is Nicole Whalen, and my question is if you're optimistic that we can keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
First of all, apparently some tweets went out from my talk 2 days ago where I said, we got to fight for every damn tenth of a degree that we can. That became clear from especially the IPCC report, number one. Because and certainly the damages in going beyond 1.5, the steepness of the curve was made clear. I do not see how we don't overshoot 1.5 degrees. We are likely to be committed to a world of 1.5 degrees on a decadal scale, not a century scale. Right. However, and this now may sound like I really am a nutty physicist, which makes me crazily optimistic, et cetera. It doesn't mean we can't address past actions. That's where this carbon removal, this carbon dioxide removal agenda comes from. When we reach net zero, doesn't mean we have to stop and can't go to negative carbon. It would take a long time. But that actually captures what I think is the overriding importance of innovating in that space. It's not only a question of offsetting some of the continuing carbon emissions, which are inevitable. That's why I said going to zero in terms of mitigation, I think, is just impossible. But we can have the compensation here, and then in the longer term, this can not only address the future, it can address the past. So I think that's a very, very important agenda. Again, talking about like in D.C. or yesterday in New York City, et cetera. I mean, those technologies are not going to be employed in those kinds of urban environments. But that's one of their attractions. They actually can be employed almost anywhere, with obviously somewhat suitable conditions. So anyway, I think that's what I'd say.
Molly Bow from Accenture. We're in a utility, one of the largest in North America. I'm curious as to what you view as the utility's role and responsibility in accelerating decarbonization. You mentioned that they are going to play a role. I was wondering if you could double-click and get a little more specific about what you see them doing.
Well, first of all, in the electricity utility world, the game is get to zero carbon as soon as possible. In saying that, I like to put out another pet theme that I didn't say earlier. It was implicit when I said we need as much optionality and flexibility as possible, i.e., give the utilities, the policymakers, you name it, every tool in the toolbox that gets to low carbon without what I would somewhat pejoratively call ideology. In this business, low carbon electricity, two that are not universally popular and are often talked about as being off the table: nuclear power. Exelon has a little bit to do with nuclear power, as I recall, and carbon capture and sequestration, or utilization and sequestration. Every region will have different low-carbon solutions. No one tool, including these, are appropriate for every region, whether for technical reasons, like sequestration sites would be an example, or for social and political reasons. Like, for example, Germany is not going to have any more nuclear power. It's a social choice, and I believe that choice will stick. But doesn't change the fact that, in particular in our innovation agenda, we should have everything on the table. Having said that, the electric utility has got a lot of choices. Obviously, the drop in solar and wind costs, and including the offshore wind now, still up there, but it's coming down rapidly. It's great possibilities. But we also have to remember, and so developing all of those is very important. Actually, I'll give you an anecdote as well. I mean, it's public. I mean, I'm on the board for the last year or so, just over a year, of Southern Company. And Southern Company is obviously a very large utility. I think many people still carry in their heads the idea of this being a very coal-heavy, carbon-intense utility. Let me say first, if it were, I wouldn't be on the board. If you want to look at the facts, in just over a decade, they've gone from 79%, whatever it is, coal, to 26% coal, replaced by gas and renewables. with a footprint of 3 states, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, that have no state requirements, no renewable portfolio standards. So driving to that, and of course, many other utilities are carrying their burden, they're carrying their share of this transformation, because it's also good business and what people want. So I think, driving that is very important. But I want to also say utilities doesn't apply only to electricity. Talk about natural gas. And this is where it gets controversial, but we are very clear that at least for, I would say, another 15 years or so, you can say plus or minus 5 years if you want, we need to have natural gas continue as part of the solution. For one thing, we have still a long way to go in the substitution for coal. We're nearly halfway there in terms of the substitution, which has been a huge part of our carbon reductions. But secondly, we are not at the point yet, we're not close to the point yet where, wind, solar, and lithium-ion batteries provide a reliable system. For example, in the California report I alluded to earlier, if you just look at the data, wind right now is about half of solar in California in terms of kilowatt hours. The inconvenience is that, let's say in 2017, there were as many as 10 days in a row with no wind. That could be very inconvenient if you're going to rely strictly on that. What it says is we need storage not only over a few hours, we need storage solutions or fuels that can serve over much longer time periods. In fact, also, I'll use California where we have the data. Both the solar and the wind resource in California is 2 to 1 or more than 2 to 1 in the summer compared to the winter. The sun, it's called latitude, right? Wind is much more variable in different locations. And so again, if we're going to drive the system to be largely dependent upon wind and solar, even solving the shorter term storage issues that you need for variable resources, what about the seasonal storage to move some of that summer stuff to the winter? Maybe it's hydrogen. Maybe it's other low carbon fuels. We can, by the way, hydrogen I call carbonless natural gas, but anyway. So I think that the drive to low carbon, no carbon, the renewables, hydro when it's available, geothermal when it's available, is frankly kind of a no-brainer for utilities leading the way. It's less obvious, but I think an important responsibility for the utilities to manage also this transition of storage. And there's not enough said about it. Look, in PJM, the storage is 1 hour, basically. California, you got 4 hours. You're getting up the cost curve pretty rapidly already at 4 hours. These are the truths. There's no point hiding them. We got to just roll up our sleeves and solve them, But it's not as simple as a lot of the discussions going on.
You've looked a lot at technologies, and really are passionate about innovation. So at least I wanted to get your sense on the innovative technologies that can really help on the grid. Where should we really be putting our emphasis now on the technologies for the grid?
Well, again, I would say I said it earlier, but what I would say is in the most generic sense, it's the integration along the entire T&D system with, one way or another, sensors and IT. One way or another, that's at the core, I think, of just about every solution in terms of the T&D system, including accommodating central generation, distributed generation, behind the meter stuff, and I think that's the high level message, I would say. Yeah, and I don't think we're doing it right now in a rather kind of incoherent fashion. I mean, I love smart thermostats, but I don't think of that as a solution. I love smart street lights that can detect gunshots. I don't call that a smart city, right? And in fact, I would just say that our view, EFI, as we work in the smart city space, just to say it clearly, I think many cities like the advertisement of the app, like the smart streetlight, for example. What you really need is the blocking and tackling first of the core foundational infrastructure, which is getting the smart grid, getting the 5G, getting these together. You do that, the apps will flow. And that will, in fact, be the foundation for tremendous entrepreneurial activity. Just give me the damn infrastructure, and I'll figure out a way to provide a new service and make some money. Become a unicorn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. We are about to transition to our panel discussion, but prior to doing so, I just wanted to highlight a few themes. One of the things that the Secretary mentioned was the importance of being pragmatic. Number two, he talked about the criticality of coalition building. Social equity, affordability is so key to this equation. Also, as a utility, in terms of the electric utility and gas, we have to be a part of this equation as well. There is a bridge to get to the end. We have to move quickly. Sometimes we may not be able to move as quickly as others want. There has to be compromise within this process, and multiple sectors are ultimately involved. So a lot there to definitely unpack as well as to definitely move on. I wanted to begin acknowledging our next panel, and as I call their names, please begin to approach the stage. And I will start with our moderator of this panel, which is Ms. Melissa Lavinson. She is our Senior Vice President of Governmental and External Affairs for Pepco Holdings. Let's give her a round of applause. Next, we have Mr. Gilbert Campbell, co-founder and principal of Volt Energy. Ralph Cavanna, Energy Co-Director, Climate and Clean Energy Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Priya Jayachandran, President of the National Housing Trust. And Dr. Robert Weisenmiller, former chair of the California Energy Commission under Governor Jerry Brown. Thank you. At the end of the panel discussion, we will have an opportunity for questions from the audience. So thank you.
Thank you, Donna. And again, I just want to thank Secretary Moniz for the framing that he gave us. It was quite compelling and talking about what we need to do to put us in a path to decarbonization of our economy, to do it expeditiously, effectively, and most of all, I think he touched on to do it equitably. And the Secretary, he did raise a lot of important issues on which I think we need to focus, including continued investment in the grid, the need for increased innovation, and the rapid and strategic deployment of low and zero carbon technologies, also and the incredible opportunity that does exist for entrepreneurship and for new market players in this decarbonized future. And as was mentioned at Pepco Exelon, we do view this future through what we're calling our connected communities vision, and we see our role really as an enabler and a platform for helping to drive this new energy future forward and in a way that provides actually the greatest benefit to the most people at the least cost. And I think that's a really important frame and hopefully something that we'll kind of touch on here during this discussion. So this includes driving more and more energy efficiency, enabling more and more distributed energy resources, and accelerating transportation electrification, among other things. These are all pathways to decarbonizing the economy. These are all things that I know that the experts on our panel today have deep knowledge about. They've been implementing policies and technologies, developing policies and technologies, and really at the forefront of their various organizations in their various fields. So I am really excited to be joined by Bob, Priya, Ralph, and Gilbert. Thank you guys for joining us today. I'm not going to go through their bios because they are available. But again, what I can say is that each of them, they really are visionary leaders in their fields. So we're really happy to have you all here with us today. So thank you. So I'm just going to jump right in with questions. And Ralph, I'm going to first start with you. So first, though, before we get started, I think for background on folks, Ralph is with Natural Resources Defense Council, and he's been a real leader in energy efficiency for decades. And so just want to first congratulate you again on your recent award from the Alliance to Save Energy. He received a Legacy Award just this past about a week ago, and it was really tremendous. I was able to be there. So again, congratulations, Ralph, for that. So first, you and your colleagues at NRDC, you have really been advancing clean energy policies for decades, including activities around energy efficiency, renewables, transportation electrification. You've conducted deep decarbonization analyses at NRDC, identifying what those critical pathways are to achieve our long-term goals, as we heard from the Secretary. So when you hear about the districts in Maryland's emissions profile in particular, and the Secretary touched on that, but again, transportation, consumption of electricity in buildings and residences. These are critical areas and sources of emissions and areas of greenhouse gases. So from your perspective and background, where do you think we need to focus in this region for Maryland and the district? And what are some of the the policies that you think of as we move forward with this?
I will cheerfully take that on. Let me say a word, though, at the outset. I'm going to be masquerading for most of this panel as a Westerner. But I need in this room to acknowledge that my first job was in the District of Columbia, a few blocks away at the Department of Justice. I have a long connection to this place. Back then, everyone in the district, the tagline was the world's most important city. As far as I know, you haven't backed off of that. And I would like to point out that the most important thing to take away from today may well be nothing that I say in the minutes ahead, but the fact that you have heard 3 senior executives of Pepco committing themselves to being essential partners in decarbonizing the economy. 5 years ago, utility leaders did not talk like that. And I'm here to tell you, knowing them reasonably well and having followed their progress, they mean it. And here's why it's incredibly good news that they mean it. The most important single part of the path to decarbonization involves the enlistment of what I have always called over the last 40 years, America's hometown utilities. Now, I assumed 40 years ago when I joined NRDC that I would spend my entire career suing these people. They were screwing up at every possible level the progress toward the clean energy transition that all of us wanted. And now they've become essential partners. How did that happen? What does that mean? In part, it means a full understanding, and you got a lot of this from Secretary Moniz, of all of the ways in which distribution companies can work with their communities to achieve aggressive decarbonization goals and to do it in a way that allows the companies to thrive. When DC passed a Clean Energy Omnibus Act in January of 2019, it established itself among the leaders in the country in the aggressiveness of its goals and in its overall commitment to every sector of the system in an affordable and reliable way, ultimately eliminating its carbon dioxide emissions. And emanating from that law, and from everything you've heard today, is the importance of the hometown utility, not because it monopolizes the solutions, but because you can move a lot faster if they're engaged and working effectively with you. I'm proud that the DC office of NRDC has several people and 2 of whom are here today with me, working on the American Cities Clean Energy Initiative from the Bloomberg Foundation. And Ernest J and Catherine Tebay are deeply embedded with the district government in working to decarbonize. And in their work, they are helping to realize the importance of that partnership. And then finally, my partner and my longtime partner at NRDC, Pat Remick, was the initiator through the DC office again of NRDC of the concept of Energy Efficiency Day. We'll be having the 4th of them on October the 2nd, as I hope you know, and there are over 400 sponsors nationally, but there's only one that did it through both a mayoral proclamation and a city council resolution. And DC will be at the list of ahead of the list of supporters as that gets underway. Energy efficiency, so this is my closing thought, a term we've heard from time to time and we can't hear often enough, will be the most important single contributor to the objective we're following together. It doesn't get as much national attention, certainly in the conversation, as solar and wind, although they're both very important too. But I just want to close with an observation that a DC-based organization, Bipartisan Policy Center, with which I'm also connected, they looked at all the contributions of all of the energy resources to the US economy over the last 40 years. And they asked the question, which resource made the biggest contribution to allowing for our economic growth and our environmental progress? It won't surprise you that they concluded that energy efficiency was the largest single contributor. It may surprise you to learn that energy efficiency's contributions exceeded those of all of the other resources together. So that, I think, is going to be a place where we're going to find a lot of our inspiration and our progress. And I look forward to working with everyone on this panel and in this room to making sure that DC remains, for this purpose at least, the world's most important city. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ralph. And just a quick follow-on, because energy efficiency, obviously, incredibly important. Decarbonizing, the economy is critical, and doing it through energy efficiency is one of the most affordable, available ways that we can do it. Another issue I know that NRDC is focused on has been transportation electrification. I think we heard some of the statistics, but in terms of emissions, it's the leading sort of in-district sort of source of emissions here in the district, as well as in Maryland. It's right up there in terms of a source of emission for the state. And one thing that I do want to mention is both the District of Columbia and Maryland have very aggressive transportation electrification goals. Both have initiated programs. We have launched the EV Smart program in Maryland thanks to order issued by the Public Service Commission there in Maryland. We just received an order in the district, so we're looking forward to working collaboratively to implement that. But if you could just talk a little bit about, because I know NRDC has been super focused on transportation electrification, what do you think are one of the one or two biggest things we need to do to really accelerate transportation electrification?
Here, I'll do my best to channel Catherine, since this is her job. One of the most important things we can do, of course, is to mobilize the electric sector to provide the necessary infrastructure for the vehicles. And that's something that Secretary Moniz spoke to. I'm going to challenge you to do something else, though. And also, by the way, you have been providing incredibly important political support. Yesterday, NRDC, the Edison Electric Institute, and Sierra Club, enormous, wonderful, diverse list of groups, went to Congress, encouraging Congress to extend the tax credit for electric vehicles and to expand its availability. But there is one thing nobody talks about in the context of electrification, and so I'm going to use this forum and this group of efficiency advocates to suggest, even as we made energy efficiency a central focus of all the work we did on building decarbonization, we need to do the same in the transportation sector. We should not assume that electric vehicles have reached their frontier of energy efficiency possibility. It is, to me, discouraging to note that 20 years ago, the GM Impact, remember the car they wrote about in the movie Who Killed the Electric Car? About 3 miles per kilowatt hour. It's about the average of the current fleet. We can do a lot better than that. And the electric sector, the electric utility sector, can provide leadership, even as it did with energy efficiency in buildings, in pushing energy efficiency frontiers for all of transportation, not just vehicles, but freight, for the way the rail systems operate. Every aspect, I can assure you, even as we all found over and over again, that there were untapped energy efficiency opportunities everywhere in the economy, in buildings and equipment, we will find that for vehicles. We should look, for example, at how much vehicles are drawing from the grid when they're shut off. Remember the vampire loads that became notorious in the context of equipment in all of our households? Well, vehicles are doing it too. And working with the manufacturers and the designers, we can help dramatically improve on that record and get more out of transportation electrification than anyone believes possible today.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Ralph. And so now I'm going to quickly turn to Bob. Bob, building off Ralph's comments, in your role as chair of the California Energy Commission, you oversaw the implementation of some of the most comprehensive state-level clean energy and climate programs in the country. And at the same time, you were the lead agency and lead state official, and actually also pulling together a comprehensive approach to resilience for the electric sector. And I think that's an important issue. As we heard, we're already well on our way to the 1.5 degrees Celsius change in global temperatures. If we hit 2 or 3 degrees, obviously that's going to have a significant impact. And that approach that you took in California also really recognized the impact on vulnerable populations. So sort of taking a step back, what was your vision for how California's complex electric system would need to evolve to both meet the state's greenhouse gas goals, but also the resilience needs that you identified as part of your collaborative process?
Thank you. I was going to start out by saying Governor Brown has viewed climate change as one of the existential threats to humanity. Certainly the other is proliferation. And so our energy policy has always really been a climate policy. And for California, that means that we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we also have to prepare for the way our climate is changing, and we have to push innovation. Now, in terms of how we've tried to deal with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we've been relatively successful in the power sector. It's gone from about 20% to about 15%. Overall, we've reduced the state's greenhouse gas emissions substantially. Transportation has been the real problem area. It's about 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. It's 80-some% of our criteria pollutants. While we have really pushed the envelope on it, it's still going up in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions on transportation. We have about 700,000 electric vehicles in California, about 47% of the electric vehicles in the US. But again, it's just not enough to really deal with the reality. At this point, we're really moving buses. There's no reason not to have electric buses. There's no reason not to have taxis, Uber, Lyft, all electric. Again, you just have to really focus on electrifying the transportation sector. Certainly, the utilities have been a major partner there. As in energy efficiency, as Ralph knows, in energy efficiency, California utilities, it's about $1.3 billion a year. Electrification of transportation, it's about $800 million now a year on the infrastructure side. So we've certainly had a real push on the infrastructure. But having said that, we're making, California is the 5th largest economy in the world. As an individual, we've certainly reduced our greenhouse gas emissions ahead of Governor Schwarzenegger's target, legislative target. But the climate is changing. And so the question is, how do we build that adaptation into the utility planning? We've had a comprehensive study in California of our changing climate assessment, the 4th one that was published last year. We're building that into the utility general rate cases. Again, the reality is that when we say it's getting hotter, we're talking about not a smooth increase, but some real periodic burst of intense heat. We're talking about climate is getting drier. Well, again, we're talking about not just a little drier each year, but periods of drought, very substantial droughts. We're talking about, obviously in California, hotter and drier means wildfires. So how do you really get the grid to where it needs to be to deal with the new climate realities? We have erosion, sea level rise, and particularly for winter storms. So that's something that is really important. Obviously, as a state, we're trying to build that into where we're building our facilities. How are we dealing with our highway system, in terms of flooding, in terms of these changes, but also to build it into all the utility infrastructure into their plans. And we're also providing the tools to local governments, because again, the reality is the climate is changing much faster than we thought, and it's the reality today. It's not something for one's grandchildren. It's not something just for the polls. It's something that you need to do right now, and every investment you make, you have to be thinking about how that changing climate is going to impact that investment.
I think, Bob, that's incredibly important, insightful, and having seen it up close, building it in on the front end is obviously much more economic than having to kind of keep rebuilding it on the back end. And from an affordability standpoint, obviously, you want to do that planning for the future as well. So quickly turning to Priya, NHT has been a leader in financing and enabling development of affordable housing, including owning and investing in multifamily housing in 14 jurisdictions, including in this region. And you also, though, not just been looking at affordable housing, but you've been a real leader in achieving providing solar and solar benefits to low-income residents. So can you talk a little bit about that nexus? Because I think that's a really interesting one. And it's important to note that, you're leading and advocating on affordable housing policy, while at the same time you focus on energy and energy affordability as a key part of that.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa and Donna and Dave, for the opportunity to be here. I'm Priya Jayachandran. As Melissa said, I lead an organization called the National Housing Trust. And we came to the energy conversation really by way of housing. We have been advocates, owners, lenders, and innovators in housing for nearly 30 years. And about a little over 10 years ago, we saw and came to the realization that utility costs were a significant driver of monthly cash flow for residents of the housing that we worked on. Historically, we had focused on rent and driving down rent because a lot of different factors, including the cost drivers of construction, it's hard to change that. And we saw an opportunity to really reveal savings and monthly cash flow to residents of affordable housing through energy efficiency. And we embraced that as owners of our own housing, doing energy retrofits wherever we could. We were early adopters of the Better Buildings Challenge. Also, renewable energy. We own the largest installation of solar on a multifamily property here in the district. And we've also helped other owners with community solar, trying to drive as much of that benefit to those who have less. We are supporters of decarbonization. Climate change is unassailable. We see energy efficiency, like Ralph, as strategy number one in that effort. There is so much low-hanging fruit. It helps folks from across the board. It drives monthly cash flow, frees up resources to invest in healthcare, children, education, all of those other important priorities, creates healthier homes, and of course, lowers the carbon footprint. And then secondarily, we've been involved in renewable energy and clean energy on our own portfolio of properties, and then helping other owners, largely affordable housing owners, on their properties. And then when we have access to a site that may not be housing, using community solar to drive those benefits to residents of our own properties or other residents. We are big supporters of decarbonization. Like I said, we've really embraced energy efficiency and renewable energy as the primary strategies. We support other strategies. Really, our mission is to alleviate poverty through access to affordable housing, through lowering monthly costs. And I think we see ourselves as a voice for saying that we want to create vibrant communities, and that those means balancing priorities. And housing is expensive. It's been, and those costs, that's a whole nother panel and a whole nother conversation, why housing has become so expensive in the US. But making it more expensive disproportionately hurts the young, minorities, and those with less resources. So decarbonization has to be equitable, and applying the same cost to everyone isn't equitable. In Secretary Moniz's words, it's regressive. And so I think we want to focus the conversation on how do you pay for it, and how is that cost not pushed onto people who have the least amount, and also that decarbonization is compatible with growth, so that we also are not reinforcing privilege and divide and creating opportunities for those who have yet to achieve it. When I got into the housing space about 25 years ago, the conversation was exclusively focused on number of units. About 5 to 10 years ago, we came to the realization that it's been more about communities. And today we think about number of units balanced with what kind of units those are. How close are they to public transportation? How close are they to healthy foods? How close are they to healthcare? How energy efficient are they? I think the decarbonization, it's a similar place and a similar reckoning. I think we are all for trying to decarbonize. I think it was nice to hear Secretary Moniz say that it's got to happen over time, and it's got to happen in a way that's compatible with all of our other priorities.
I think that's a really good point and really important. I think, we're in a really positive place here in the region, in which we operate in the district in Maryland, et cetera, that, the issue of affordability is always front and center. I know, very familiar with some of the programs here in the district through the residential aid discount. I know there's going to be a senior rate that's coming in a arrears management program. So really focusing on the fact that we recognize that, there are members of society, there are customers that need that kind of additional assistance, and so having those programs available, coupled with the community solar program, Solar for All, really can allow us to really get the best of both worlds of moving forward with decarbonization while at the same time maintaining affordability for all of our customers, and I think that's really critical. Gilbert, I want to talk to you because you've done a lot in this area, particularly on energy equity, on advancing renewable energy, electric vehicle charging stations. Volt Energy, you are a national leader in this. You're providing energy solutions, clean energy solutions to residents, to commercial, to government. You've been extremely active in this region. Can you just talk a little bit, particularly as a developer and as a business owner, in terms of what are the policies that you look for in a region, in an area, in order to really want to invest, in order to want to really make that difference and move our new energy economy forward?
Sure. And first, I'd like to thank you, Melissa, Donna, and Dave, for having me. And from a developer standpoint, since we're financing through PPA solar projects, one of the most important things that we look for is a strong renewable portfolio standard in the district. So obviously, Washington, D.C. has the best RPS in the country. I believe it's 100% by 2032, and the solar carve-out is also very strong as well, too. So that's one thing. We also look at what is the ability to do third-party financing, whether it's a solar PPA or a solar lease. There's still a lot of states that don't allow third-party financing. We look at community solar. There's 19 states, including the District of Columbia, that allow for community solar. We look at things like what are the net metering policies, interconnection policies within a certain jurisdiction, and then obviously we also look at the cost of electricity.
So, building off that, I know that, when you do your investments, you're not only investing in the technology, but you have a big passion in sort of investing in with the workforce of the future, in making sure that opportunities aren't just provided to those that have historically received opportunities, but that you're creating a more inclusive environment as well. And that's something that's really important to us here at Pepco too. So can you talk a little bit about kind of where you see that going and what more we can do in that area?
Sure, and I want to commend Pepco and Exelon for being a great partner, not just from investing in diverse suppliers as you move forward with alternative energy, but really showing up in the community, being great partners. So for us, that's one of our biggest passions as a company, is to make sure that all of the investments that we make are fair and equitable. And if we're honest, low to moderate income and primarily black and brown people, through environmental justice, environmental racism, when you look at the past, have suffered the most from climate change. When you look at where coal power plants are, where most of our major highways are, that's why in our lower income communities we have higher rates of asthma. So how can we reverse that trend? I think we have to be intentional. And part of that is in showing up in communities that historically may not make financial sense. So for example, we did a project about 7 years ago at Florida Avenue Baptist Church, which was this very small project, like 10 kW. But we wanted to get in the community and do a project and prove that an African-American church could do solar and go beyond that. So they became the first church to do solar, but as a result, we helped the church create a green ministry. So we went in and we worked with like the senior citizens in the church and start really understanding how to read the utility bills, which can be difficult, and understand, what are some of the policies out there, energy efficiency and renewable policies that they could invest in themselves. With that, now, if you go to the church, they have youth that will give you a tour of the solar. They'll talk about how everything works. And then I think the second thing is investing in our youth, which is critically important. So one of the projects we're doing right now, we're doing a solar project at Howard University where we're putting solar in 10 different buildings on campus, as well as energy storage and electric vehicle charging stations. But the part that excites me the most is getting students engaged. So we've got business school students we're working with so they understand how do we look at financing projects. We have communication students, so be able to understand we have to do, how do we do press releases, how do we communicate our information. Obviously engineering school students, the law school, what are the contracts that we have to deal with. And the blessing with that is, it's gotten out there what we're doing at Howard. I got an email probably about 2 weeks ago from a student and said, I'm concerned about some of the sustainability issues on campus. And, there was the strike last week, the global strike. And I really want to get more engaged with the university. So called her back and said, let's set up an audience for you with the CEO of Howard University, the director of sustainability. And from that really led to a meeting where they decided they're going to partner with the university and create a sustainability council. And I'd like to recognize 2 of those students are here, Destiny and Adriana. Could you stand up for a quick second? That's our future. Destiny and Adriana, and then even earlier yesterday you called me and said, you wanted to go out into, I believe it was in Maryland, and work with churches, nonprofits, community centers, and help people understand how can they reduce their energy footprint in low to moderate income communities. So I just think investing in young people is smart business. And then the last thing I would just say, Colgate trademarked the term backpack marketing. And really what it is, they would work with like elementary school students about brushing your teeth and things of that nature. So if we go into schools and work with youth, they can take that message home about the importance of energy efficiency and renewables. So that's some of the work that we do, but really it's about getting students and the youth involved.
Thanks, and I think that's actually, something that's obviously incredibly important, something I know that we're working on, we're investing in through a lot of partnerships we have on STEM education, working with community-based organizations, because you're right, it is about the future, right? We have to build for the future, and we have to do it today, obviously, as we heard, and as the climate crisis is growing. And you did also mention the fact about environmental justice communities, right? And that, low, moderate income communities tend to be the most disproportionately impacted. And you mentioned, living near highways, transportation hubs, et cetera. So I want to ask a quick question, and, Ralph, Bob, if you guys want to start, and then Priya, Gilbert, please chime in. But in terms of, some of the investments that we need to make, particularly in the transportation system, again, Ralph and Bob, you touched on this a bit, but what are some of the policies that we really need to sort of accelerate transportation electrification? Because when I think about one of those areas where we can get some real co-benefits, right? We can drive down transportation sector emissions in terms of greenhouse gases, which is going to be critical going forward. We can advance new technologies and innovation, including battery technology, obviously, that way. And you get that public health benefit, which is so needed, particularly for communities that live near highways or transit hubs. So can you just talk a little bit about where you think we really need to go to accelerate that?
I think that the first and most important thing we need to do is to fully mobilize the nation's electric distribution system. So that has started. What you are hearing today from Pepco, you are hearing increasingly around the country. Pepco has many sincere imitators. This is a good thing. So it won't surprise you that Southern California Edison and Portland General Electric talk this way. But Detroit Edison, Ameren, Missouri, the Southern Company now has incentive compensation for its board, including Ernie Moniz, tied in part to their success in meeting their low carbon emissions goals. So that's all positive. There's something that's going to be important in doing that. If we're going to be able, if we want to use the distribution system much more intensely to electrify transportation, we're going to need to make sure and use it wisely. We're going to need to send price signals to people so that they are using the system at times when electricity is most widely and cheaply available. And we're going to have to be willing to innovate around the way we price electricity in ways that we really have. For a century, the innovation in electricity pricing has really not been at the forefront of the national consciousness. It doesn't have to be at the forefront of the national consciousness, but it has to be very much part of what those of us who work with electric distribution companies are talking about, I think. Bob, I know you have a lot more to add.
Well, I think looking at, again, this is a huge transformation. We're really talking about trying to switch transportation to electricity, and it has enormous benefits. So the question is, how do you really mobilize that? Now again, in California, we've provided rebates for people with electric vehicles. We've also provided rebates for, basically you can use those rebates to do charging infrastructure. We're much more focused at this stage on workplace charging than home charging. I mean, the reality is that all electricity is not the same. We have periods during the day where we have surpluses, and we have periods during the day where it's very tight. And we would like people to be basically pulling from the grid, recharging their vehicles in the afternoon or morning, not at night, given our current situation in California. And we also would like to get in a position where we can use the batteries in those vehicles to really help with the grid. I mean, we're moving to a grid. Obviously, at this point, wind and solar are the best buys, but they're intermittent. So we need to have much more of a two-way conversation here. And to the extent that you have, as I said, California, we have 700,000 electric vehicles. To the extent you can use those, both in terms of when they're buying electricity and also when they can potentially provide it back to the grid. That again gives you a lot of opportunities. And when we talk about vehicles, obviously as you go from people's cars to buses, you've got much more capacity. As you go from buses, again, the whole taxi fleet. I mean, Shenzhen in China now has electric buses, electric taxis everywhere, but then also for electric trucks. I mean, again, you're talking about we really need to be moving trucks over to both the long haul and the short term, moving those over electricity. Now again, that gives you a lot of opportunities if you're trying to move stuff around with much quieter vehicles. You could presumably do a lot more deliveries at night than if you're talking about diesel. But at the same time, trucks have a phenomenal draw. So once, if you have a long haul truck that's pulling up at, someone's charging station and getting recharged, you could be talking megawatt scale for those chargers. So again, we really have to be making sure that we rethink the whole distribution grid to really drive the vehicles, but we also have to really move that, more generally into our society. So one of the things like the Energy Commission has done is take bolts and make them available in some of our poorer communities. Sort of, sign up for it, you can drive it. And again, get that out, not just providing subsidies to the people buying cars, but trying to get cars out on the ground that in our more disadvantaged communities for people to get an experience with those. So again, it's a huge transformation, a huge challenge. Again, I'm sure here most of your criteria pollutants are from transportation. So, this is a real opportunity to help on those neighborhoods next to freeways. But, we're going to have to really mobilize across the board. And certainly, the utility is going to be a huge part. I mean, the last thing you want is people getting the vehicles and discovering they can't charge them, right? I've certainly gotten some calls on that. So you need to get out front of that issue.
Yes, we
really
have to.
think through, the natural charging locations.
No, and I think that's important, the location, and you touched on buses, you touched on rideshare, and Priya, Gilbert, please feel free to chime in. I think, particularly when you look again at modes of transportation, that this region in particular, the sort of the greater DC, Maryland, Virginia region, we have a lot of great public transportation options. We have bus fleets, et cetera. So sort of when you think about that and accessibility, public health, et cetera, love to hear some of your thoughts on the transitioning of sort of the transit system in and of itself and some of the benefits that could provide.
Just like I think we're focused on energy efficiency because of trying to reduce usage, I'd say similarly in the transportation conversation, I think there has to be equal focus on trying to reduce usage as well as improve the efficiency of the fleet. I'm not anti-car, but I think the easiest and best solution is, and the cheapest, is for people to simply drive less. I think it's a bad analogy. You can make guns so that they don't kill people as easily, or you can focus on people not killing each other. And I think that we would focus, and I think the challenge there, though, is historically, whether in California, I grew up in Salinas, or in the DMV here, is that we've made it harder and harder for all people, particularly low-income people, to live close to public transportation. You think about our own WMATA system here and Metro and DC, it is increasingly hard to afford to live anywhere on a Metro line. And God forbid we grow and go dense anywhere near a subway stop. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have, equal to the conversation about what is the source of the energy for that transportation fleet, but how do we get people to drive less? I would posit that the way you get them to drive less is that they're closer to public transportation, and that means creating more job and housing options near those nodes of public transportation, which we've really gotten to a point over the last 10 to 20 years where as communities we block.
Yeah. And I would just add, I agree wholeheartedly with what fellow panelists said. Outside of just mass transit, like DC has a lot of electric bus fleets. But UPS and FedEx, for example, are willing to make, and they started to make investments in electric fleets. Same thing with Uber and Lyft. There's a commitment from both companies to move to EV fleets. But the challenge is, especially like in the District of Maryland, where are the charging stations? And I know we sit on several panels together and boards and stuff trying to figure that out. But I think we have to invest in the infrastructure and also investing in the infrastructure in an equitable way. And I think someone mentioned it before, the cost of EVs is obviously very high. So how do we make sure that underserved communities can benefit as well? And I think part of it is, again, it goes back to community outreach, because you have the upfront cost, but the cost of ownership of cars, when you talk about insurance, gas, parking, is very expensive, where EVs can bring that cost down. So even things like a secondary market where you're reselling cars may be a great opportunity for underserved communities to look at buying electric vehicles.
I think that's great. I know I've seen programs in other states kind of focused on that, and that secondary car market is important. And I know in sort of other pilots I've seen, right, the secondary battery market. Mm-hmm. So the Secretary touched a little bit on energy storage and the topic of storage, both to help with intermittency of renewable resources, but also as a resilience strategy. Ralph, start with you. Love to hear your thoughts on that. In particular, how do you see storage actually integrating into the electric grid, but also potentially as a resilience support, even as we move towards more of an electrified transportation system?
Yeah, and I think the most important thing for me to emphasize is, for many people, storage means one thing. It means batteries. And there are, in fact, a whole host of a portfolio of options for storage, many of which involve the demand side, where you're getting people to adjust their consumption in ways that support the system, sometimes for just a few hours, sometimes for longer. The more energy efficient the buildings are, of course, the greater resilience they will have in riding through cold and hot spells. So what our hope is simply that the orchestra conductor, in the end, the entity that's choosing among the different storage options to try to build the most resilient and affordable possible system, namely the Pepcos of the world, are thinking broadly about all of those options and giving all of them a chance to compete and picking the best buys first.
Yeah, I was going to say the thing that's obvious at this stage is that, when you look at the lifetime for cars, there are a lot of second-use batteries now coming up. The zero electric vehicles have been around since, fill in the blanks, 2010, 2000, so that...
My mother had one in 2004.
Yeah, so anyway, what are you going to do with those? And, we've done a lot of demonstrations, and again, the obvious place for second use is with the grid. We also, as a society, have to be planning. What are we going to do? China at this point has rules that, making sure that the batteries are recycled, that, they go into second use in sort of grid projects. They end up somewhere other than landfills. And so the time is now to think that part through. But again, certainly storage really enables or not. As Ralph said, there's a lot of variation as you get to a smarter grid. You have a lot of possibilities. smart inverters do a lot. You know, getting the sensors, getting the technology out. Storage is not the only answer. Certainly demand response has a lot of appeal too. And you know, it's not an either or, but we really have to be pursuing as many options as we can, since frankly not all of them are going to pan out. And you know, certainly there are issues on the battery side, but again, we really need a smart grid, we need smart consumers, we need to make sure people have options. And to deal with the resilience question, again, we need to make sure that when you get to a very hot day in DC, that you know, the lights stay on, power's there.
We're working really hard to make sure that happens. As I know, all of the excellent family companies, utilities are. So just kind of building off that, and Secretary Moniz talked about that a bit too, the two-way flow of power, but the two-way flow of communication is really important. He also, though, mentioned issues around, you know, security of that information, privacy, et cetera. I know that, you know, again, California has done a lot in that regard. Other states across the country have as well. Any comments on some of those policies that are in place, or kind of things we need to look for as we move forward on that?
Well, I mean, obviously California was one of the first real drivers on basically rolling out the smart building systems. And you know, frankly, we would, based upon everyone's experience at this point, we would make different choices on those meters than we did. And so certainly California is always an opportunity for people to learn from both our successes and our mistakes. But looking at, you know, it's really important to really give people the enabling capabilities there. And as you said, cybersecurity certainly is something which underlies everything we're doing at this stage. But again, you really have to have a very sophisticated grid platform to really give people choices, you know, moving forward, and at the same time make sure that it is secure, to make sure that their basic information is secure. You know, that's, you know, these things are challenging. I mean, you know, we talk about the wildfires in California. I mean, one of them was caused not by PG&E, but by some poor, you know, woman's, you know, microgrid, you know, that someone installed, but it was not a qualified electrician. So I mean, again, this is serious stuff that you have to do well.
Melissa, I would add, I think we're all concerned about data privacy in the year 2019. I think that has to be balanced, though, against the opportunity that data provides, and a plug for benchmarking and whole buildings data, because I think that has been, in the built environment, a real impediment to energy efficiency, particularly in the multifamily housing, is that you never could get a real read on what the performance was. And the response back from many of the utilities was always, well, it's a data privacy issue, and there's got to be a way to that those goals are compatible. And when I was at HUD, we, for the FHA portfolio, instituted benchmarking. Wasn't popular at first, but I think, you know, in California has passed benchmarking, and I think, you know, it needs to happen more broadly, and I would argue the utilities need to embrace it voluntarily and start sharing that data so people can have a snapshot into building performance and figure out where should they make those investments, and how could this save money.
Yes, and I think the benchmarking is actually a critical thing, and you know, there's ways to use that, and I know there's lots of vendors out there that actually provide that service, including, you know, Oracle Utilities, formerly O-Power, et cetera. So I think, you know, there's those opportunities. Are we turning to the, yes, audience questions?
Each panelist has spoken about affordability and societal equity and guarding against environmental injustice. And we see that certainly in DC. You mentioned the discount programs that we have and how those are benefiting consumers. That is true. However, my question and my concern is, how do we embed the issue of social equity, of affordability, into the system as we move forward? I will share with you that the discount programs, as you well know, are very low, their penetration level is very low, so that you get 1 or 2 or 3% of participation, which means the vast majority of LMI customers are not participating. And more importantly, or equally important, is the fact that those that do, when you look at that world, the people that are participating and getting a benefit, what happens is that the amount that they are being paid is recovered from the next level of consumers. So yes, they are benefiting, but other consumers are paying higher rates. So my question then becomes, how do we embed that goal, that aspirational goal, into what we're doing so that it is tangible, so that it is not a Band-Aid, that it's not an afterthought, that it is not something that just makes us feel good because we say, oh yeah, well, we have discount programs. Oh yeah, we believe that social injustice is wrong. Or yes, we believe that rates should be affordable, when we haven't even defined what's affordability. It's a question that we can't answer today, but my concern and my recommendation is that we really we prioritize that and build it into the matrix of where as we go forward. So it's not an afterthought, but it is a primary objective and goal.
Can I just chime in with excellent point. I think one of the things that can be done, DC has very good policy to target low to moderate income residents. And you've got responsible businesses like Pepco and other firms that want to enact this. But we need community partners that can go in that have a trusted relationship with residents, low to moderate income residents. So I think there's an opportunity for better partnerships. And there's organizations out there that are doing that, but I think there needs to be a stronger coalition between policymakers, business, and trusted community partners to make that happen at a faster pace.
And just one respectful addition from a former witness for the Office of People's Counsel. My testimony is somewhere in the files about 30 years back. On this issue, and it was about 30 years back, California started out at the same low participation rate in its discount programs and its bill assistance programs. It has had remarkable success in driving those rates up. And although I almost never offer a California model to a DC audience with any hope of success, we're well over 50% now and driving higher. And I think you're entitled to insist that the DC do just as well.
Yeah, I was going to say two things. I mean, obviously we've had a lot of focus on these issues in California. One of the things which we at the commission did was put together sort of metrics, and looking at what we characterize as disadvantaged communities, which have gone through and identified the 10% that have the most impact from pollution, but look at things like disconnection issues, where the state's money's going, to try to make sure that basically the environmental justice community, basic disadvantaged, are really full participants. The other thing is a very interesting case that Commissioner Rechtschaffen has just started on affordability at the PUC. And again, we have discounted rates, we've got programs, but they've really refocused the question to affordability and looking at essential services and saying, okay, what percentage of people's income goes for those services? How many hours would people have to work at minimum wage to purchase the essential services? Because I think his fear is that the programs we put in place now aren't dealing with the realities out on the ground. So again, they've had a workshop, they have a draft report out, they're going to have another workshop. Cliff indicated they expect a decision sometime later this year. But again, I think his fear is that you've got some subsidies here or some subsidies there, but are they comprehensive enough to deal with the problem now?
My name is Mark Rodefer. I'm the chair of the Sierra Club's DC chapter. And unfortunately, I do not share Secretary Moniz's optimism that we can keep relying on gas peaker plants for another 20 years. I think we need to stop getting off of them a lot sooner than that. And we also need to stop burning methane gas in people's homes. So my question is about, well, first, there's a threat as we get off gas for thermal heating in homes that could get very expensive as we rely on electricity. we will need to pair it with efficiency so that we don't do it in a way where we need billions of dollars in upgrades to the grids and dozens of new substations and things like that. So my question is, what's the best way to move from gas to electricity and to pair that with electrification? And also in terms of housing, I think it's important to start with affordable housing, right? Because a heat pump is going to be a lot more affordable in the long run than gas is. And as we move off of gas, the stranded assets and the cost of dealing with those is going to be really expensive. So we need to make sure that affordable housing is some of the first to get off gas. So my question is, what is the best way to approach this for affordable housing, but for everyone else as well, in a way that will be cost effective?
And Ralph or Bob, do you want to start? 'Cause I know you've done a lot of work on that, given the...
Yeah. Well, I mean, in California, we've been struggling with the gas issue. Obviously, we had a major accident at San Bruno and another one at Aliso Canyon. And so the question becomes safety and emissions from the gas system. We're primarily gas for our space and water heating. And so at this point, there's a movement more at the local level at different cities. Berkeley was the first one, actually Santa Monica may have been before Berkeley, to say for new construction, it has to be all electric. And again, if you think about it, if you continue to build new construction with gas, you're just digging your hole deeper. And it's a lot easier to do it right now than it is to go back through the retrofit. Now, presumably over time, you might get the heat pump cost down. You might actually get installers trained in a way that makes the other conversions easier. But at least the first step is, new construction.
And on affordability, I want to yield to Priya.
Thanks, Ralph. I think we've approached it that energy efficiency is probably your step one, because whether you're gas or electric, unless the system is efficient, you're not going to be optimizing your energy use. So let's make sure that our usage is efficient. For new construction, we support electrification requirements like San Jose, like Berkeley, like others have passed. I think the appliances, the dryers, the stoves, the furnaces, the water heaters, those are still expensive. You don't have to run the gas line, but I think that there's an opportunity there. The reality is that a lot of low-income people live in older housing, and the cost of retrofitting it is expensive. And so I think we want to support electrification, but it's got to be tempered with what are those costs, and we don't want it to become a veiled tool for opposing growth, and so that people effectively are not building that housing or retrofitting it because they can't afford to, and people are pushed further and further out.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to just take one prerogative and ask one last quick lightning round moderator question before we close it out. So we're talking about moving ahead, looking at the future. We're talking about trying to put in policies that will get us to where we need to go 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out. So just quickly, just kind of each of you from your experience, kind of what is the kind of sort of 1 or 2 forward-looking policies that you think we need to get us there and to really make that transition, particularly in our sector?
Want to go down the line?
Sure.
I would say I think the carbon policy that Secretary Moniz mentioned would be a strong start to make it more equitable and seeing solar in more places than just places that we have now. And then I think just smarter policy when you're talking about EV infrastructure would be the 2 things I would say.
For me, all of us, I assume, will say carbon policy, and Secretary Moniz had some interesting things to say about that. I care a lot about America's hometown distribution companies, as you all know. I think it's going to be terribly important to make sure that they have incentives that allow them to thrive as they work to decarbonize, that those incentives reward them for improved performance, and DC is well on the way toward being a national example for that. And I also encourage all of you to consider as a final element of this, part of this is about reminding everybody constantly, this is not about pushing you someplace unpleasant or depriving you as a people of something that you value. This is about moving to a better place. That's what the clean energy transition is. That's what it's been ever since it started decades ago. And this is a room full of people who are very well equipped to carry that message. We need that in order to succeed.
I would bring it back to housing and say that I think that we can lower the carbon emissions by creating more housing. We have not preserved and constructed housing that has kept pace with population growth and population migration patterns over the last 20 years. And as a result, people are living farther and farther from where they need to get to, living inefficiently because they don't have any other option. And I think from a policy perspective, investing in more housing, particularly affordable housing, but also all housing would improve our carbon footprint.
Oh, again, I think we have a clear vision for decarbonization. We need a plan on how to get there, but it's really important to think through the impacts of the changing climate and address that in everything we build. And it's also important to look at, as we have a much greater role for the grid, electrifying transportation, electrifying buildings, we have to make sure it's going to be reliable. And so again, there will be a trade-off, a question of how, what is the requirements there, but we have to have a pretty clear vision. Or I think as a regulator, we're always trying to give the utilities a pretty clear signal. This is what we need from you. This is what you need to do on adaptation. This is what you need to do on electrification. You figure out how to do it, and certainly do it wisely. But none of us want the backlash from citizens if, as we're going forward, if we start running into reliability problems, particularly in times when the climate is stressful.
Thank you. Let's give all of our panel of experts a round of applause. This panel, as well as the Secretary's keynote address, has given us a lot to think about more. I know everyone in this room has a laser vision towards all of the issues that we've discussed, but it just really, from my perspective, really brings it home about how quickly we definitely have to move on this, and we have to move on this through partnership as well as collaboration. One of the things that I wanted to share with you is that this particular event has been taped, so you can access it on Facebook Live by visiting Pepco to connect. Thank you so much for being here. And a point of personal privilege, I want to recognize again, Mr. Gilbert Campbell mentioned the two students, I believe from Howard University, who are here. And I know Mr. Dennis Chestnut also has two students with a construction program out of Ward 7. And I always say that's our future. And just thank each and every one of you that are in the audience for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to be with us on today, and for all that you're doing in order to bring about the change that is really upon us that we need to act on. So thank you for everything that you do. Have a wonderful evening.